Hey everybody. Last we talked about Congress. We're going to talk about Congress again today. We're going to go into a little bit more detail. We're going to talk about what they actually do and how it is they do it. Hopefully, all right. If you recall, I mean, the big idea that branch of government, the legislative branch, what they're supposed to be doing is making law. And Congress again was established by Article One of the Constitution. In Article 1 of the Constitution, creates two legislative chambers. One is the Senate, and one is the House of Representatives. The Senate has 100 members. You have two per state. The House of Representatives has 435 members. Um, that 435 is a mixed number, but each state's the number of representatives they have will fluctuate based on population numbers, which we record by the census every 10 years. So your state might pick up a few representatives, or it might conceivably lose a few representatives, or I guess it could stay the same too. Just like the electoral college changes, the number of electors you have for your state might change, every 10 years. So congratulations, you've been elected to Congress, and we said the idea at Congress is to pass legislation, to create laws. So you might, and before something's a law, it's a bill, okay, and then when it's passed by Congress and when it's passed by the White House, where it goes through some other processes, it becomes a law. So you might ask yourself, who writes the laws? It's not Barry Manilow, as it turns out. He writes the songs. Okay, enough of that. All right. So who writes the laws? And it's not, or the bills rather, that might become laws. And the question is not as easy as it might seem. All right. If you go to some congressional websites, they'll tell you, well, you could write a bill and it could become a law. So certainly constituents can, policy groups, trade organization, labor unions, and I don't know, every once in a while, legislatures. When I elect someone to Congress, that's my expectation is that they're going to go to Congress and they're going to write laws for their constituents. But there's a lot of research out there that indicates that there's a lot of copy and paste legislation out there, that a lot of times it's not the legislature so much writing the law, but it's these other organizations. The piece that comes to mind is something that I read in USA Today, and I think the Arizona Republic had it. And they said that what actually happens is that a trade organization, a policy group will come up with a model law or bill, and they'll send it out to different state houses, because remember, they make laws at the state level too. They'll send it out to Congress, and they'll say, we think this is a great idea. You should make this into this bill into a law. You should introduce it. And a lot of times that's what happens. They did like a word analysis on all the legislation, and what they found is that the words were almost identical. The phrasing was almost identical on legislation from state to state, which would suggest that they're copying and pasting just like you'll do on papers in high school. Don't do that. I'm sure you'll do your own original work. But anyways, when a bill gets to Congress, it has to be introduced in the Senate or the House. It's usually, it can be either one, with the exception of legislation that has to do with money. We know from our last video that has to start in the House, and it has to be, no matter who wrote it, it has to have a sponsor. That sponsor will be an individual congressperson, or sometimes it'll be a committee, and we'll talk about committees in a second. You also, when you take a look at legislation, you'll see that it has co-sponsors. And when you hear people touting their accomplishments in Congress, they'll say, well, I sponsored this legislation, I co-sponsored this legislation, I co-sponsored that. So a co-sponsor is just sign up and say that they support the legislation. One indicator that it's serious legislation is if there's a lot of co-sponsors. That legislation is going to have a better chance to pass because it's already got support from different members. Oh, not again, please. Sorry, Barry, we got to move on. All right, congratulations. You've been elected to Congress. One of the first things that happens is you'll be appointed to a committee, and there are different types of committees. There are standing committees, there are joint committees, and there are special committees. The standing committees are the committees, they're permanent, and they do a lot of the work in Congress, right? The joint committees are committees that have members from both the House and the Senate. And the special committees are committees that are only for a certain period of time. Maybe they're addressing one specific problem, and they'll just essentially expire or dissolve after they've addressed that one problem. The standing committees are where most of the work gets done, as I understand it, in Congress. So in the House, there are more standing committees than there are in the Senate. And if you take a look at the lines I've drawn, when I did my research, uh, these committees in the House, Appropriations, Budget, and Ways and Means, are said to be some of the more influential committees. So maybe members of Congress who have been there for a while, these are the committees they want to get on. And they're influential, I would imagine, because they deal with money. All three of those committees deal with money. But I'm told in the House, by far, the most influential committee is the Rules Committee, who sets up rules on as to how legislation is going to be introduced and how it can be changed and how the votes are going to happen. So they wield a lot of power, the members of the Rules Committee in the House. In the Senate, the Rules Committee isn't as important, I'm told, because the way they do things is more established and more streamlined. But the more important committees in the Senate are the Appropriations, the Armed Services, and the Foreign Relations committees. And I think it's probably because it gets them a lot of press time. Um, Armed Services, Foreign Relations, those are the kind of committees that get you on Sunday talk shows. They get reporters asking you questions about because the public tends to be interested or more interested in those kind of things. So congratulations. You made it to Congress. Now you have to find your committee. So the committees, the appointments, I guess I should talk about that. The appointments are done by the party bosses. So you're elected, maybe you make a list of 4 or 5 committees that you'd like to join, but the ranking members in that chamber will decide who's going to go where and where you're going to be slotted. And if you go one place, it doesn't mean that you necessarily will stay there for your entire tenure of Congress. You might move from a committee to committee. So committees are further broken down into subcommittees, and I just took this off the internet the other day, and this shows the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee in the Senate. All right, you can see that Ron Johnson of Wisconsin is the chairman. A chairman in a committee has the most power in the committee because he's going to decide which legislation they're going to consider. He's kind of like the gatekeeper. But in addition to these committees, you also have subcommittees. So you further specialize. So you're more of an expert in, or you hear more about issues in these specific areas that fall under your committee. All right. So I'll travel back this way again. Because in the House, I need to tell you, there's 435 members, right? So most people will just serve on one committee, either a full standing committee or a subcommittee. Now in the Senate, it's a little bit different. Even though there's fewer committees, there's also fewer members. So a lot of times in the Senate, you'll serve on multiple committees. All right. So you're on a committee. You've considered some legislation. You've worked up the bill. Hopefully, one day, it gets to go to the entire body or chamber of Congress for a vote. Now, before it goes to the president, who might sign it into a law, both the House and the Senate have to pass the identical version. Then it comes to Congress. Then it goes to the White House, and the president can either sign it or not sign it. The easiest way for something to become a law is that it goes before the president. He or she signs it, apparently with a very large pen, then it's a law. Okay, that's one way. But there are other ways too. Another thing that can happen is that The legislation can come from the House and the Senate. It goes to the president, but the president doesn't do anything with it. Once he receives that legislation, he essentially has a 10-day clock to do something with it, not counting Sundays. So if he declines to do anything with it, he doesn't sign it to make it a law, he doesn't veto it, and we'll talk about that in a second, he just does nothing with it, then it automatically becomes a law, even without the president's signature. Now let's talk about the veto part. Here's what can happen too. Congress sends the identical legislation to the president. The president doesn't like it. He can veto it. If you veto something, you cancel it, you reject it. All right. Now, here's what can happen. Usually, when he vetoes it, he's going to write a note on there and he's going to say, I'm vetoing it because I don't like this, this, or this. All right. So Congress can then choose to rework the legislation to make it more agreeable to the president and rescind it, or they can try to override his veto. To override his veto, they need 2/3 of each chamber to vote yes for the bill, and then it overrides a presidential veto. This is very rare. I mean, I remember learning about this kid, and I don't think anybody ever, as a kid, I don't think anybody ever mentioned this to me. This doesn't happen very often. In the history of Congress, there have been around 2,600 vetoes. Only about 100 or so have been overridden. That is, 2/3 of each chamber has voted to override the president's veto and make it a law. So that doesn't happen very often. Now, there's another thing that can happen, and it's called a pocket veto. I said before there have been 2,600 vetoes in the history of Congress. About 40% of them have been pocket vetoes. And this is how a pocket veto works. The legislation is sent to the White House. The president decides that he's not going to sign it, but he's also not going to send it back right away. He's going to wait, and if it's in the 10-day window, he's going to wait until Congress adjourns, which an adjournment means Congress is no longer in session. Maybe they've left for a holiday break. Maybe it's between sessions, whatever. But he's going to put it in his pocket, so to speak, and he's not going to send it back. So Congress doesn't have the opportunity to override the veto. Now, I say it's happened a lot in history, about 40% of the time, but it's not happened a lot in recent history. I'm making this video in late 2020. The last time this happened was in the Clinton administration, which ended in 1991. There are probably a couple reasons for this. One, in general, there aren't as many vetoes now because there's a lot of communication between the White House and Congress as to what the president's going to sign. So they have an opportunity to get the legislation to the point where they know the president's going to sign it, or he's not going to sign it, or she will consider a future scenario. I hope we have a she president at some point. All right. Another thing that's happened that's made this less likely is that people started to notice in 1938 there was a Supreme Court decision that essentially said that Congress could appoint designees, people to get word from the president on how he's feeling about legislation. So before, the president had the cover of saying, well, I would have returned it, but you weren't in session, so I didn't. Well, now it's as simple as the president doesn't have that cover anymore. The president will be notified that, hey, we're out of session, but Senator so-and-so is staying in town, and you can communicate to him if you have issues with the legislation. So we don't see the pocket veto much anymore. So despite all these things, bills do become laws. All right. During the most recent full session of Congress, and I believe that would have been probably the 115th, 443 bills became laws. Now that's out of about 10,000. All right. So only about 4.5% during that congressional session of the bills became laws. So that's a lot of bills to become laws, but it's kind of a rare thing when you consider how much work they're putting in there. Also, some of the bills that become laws aren't really game changers so much. If you want to name a post office, that's a law too. So it's not really consequential legislation. Uh, Over the past 23 Congresses, and I did this research myself, on average, each Congress, and a Congress lasts for 2 years, they've passed 537 laws. So, that's quite a bit of work. 537. You can do the math. What is that? 250, 260 on average a year. Which makes me start to think about bills, and maybe the greatest bills of all time, or maybe not. Kill Bill, those were pretty good movies. And then when I think about bills, I think about Bill Murray, and maybe Groundhog Day was my favorite. But if you've been in school for any amount of time, you've probably been exposed to this bill, which is the greatest Bill movie of all time. And it's Schoolhouse Rock: How a Bill Becomes a Law. When I went to research this, because I wanted to just play a snippet of it for you, I found it on a lot of congressional websites. So even congressional members are using this video, which was created probably back in the 70s, maybe the 80s. My guess is the 70s because I remember it. A lot of congressional members are using this to educate their constituents on how a bill becomes a law. If you've not heard it, it's kind of catchy. You're going to listen to a little bit of it now.
You sure got to climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in
There's the committees.
But I know I'll be a law someday. At least I
Only about 4% of you, Bill.
But today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." And he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill.
All right, it's a catchy tune, and it's a way a lot of us learn how bills become laws. But I hope you learned a little bit more from my video, and I would encourage you to go back and watch that video in full. All right, I'll see you later. Good day.